We're really happy to have Lana with us. She is one of the foremost experts on really working with families in all different settings and how to engage families. So, the purpose of the webinars is to really talk about dissemination, to talk with people who are doing this work, but also to engage all of you. So, we will have time for questions, for comments. I encourage you, if you're in a place where you can turn on your camera, to do so. It's easier to give a talk when you have some feedback, but if you can't, please be active in the chat. So here are some, let's see, there are surveys we are asking for people before. You all probably noticed when you registered for the webinar to give feedback, but we're also getting feedback after the webinar because we want to make sure with ISSBD that you're getting the information that you need. And I think one of the things that we're doing is we are hoping to give you sort of what's working for us, but we have the idea that this will be done and will be taken back to your own communities and your own work. And we know that that will look a little bit different depending on your setting. So we encourage you to take this information. So the next webinar, Julie, who is our next webinar?
So it's somebody from Portugal, and I will, give some announcements about this after this one is over. But yeah, we become a little bit more. We moved to like Europe, and then eventually we moved to like Asia in terms of our speakers. And I think you all will see that like the times will shift as well. But just remember, like if there's a time or a day that doesn't work for you, still register, and then you can get the recording sent to you via email.
Okay, so please keep coming, and these are wonderful resources. Just, I think it's great if the time doesn't work for you, that you'll have the recording. So, um, and I think I'm going to turn things over to Lana because I hope she'll tell you a little bit more about herself and her background. She's also an amazing friend and an amazing parent. So she might share a little bit of her own home life and experience outside of the classroom and outside of research too. So I'll turn it over to Lana.
All those things might come up in the presentation. I have to start off by saying I am so excited to talk to you today. I get to talk about a lot of fun things, but this might be the most fun because I just love working in communities. So to have the opportunity to talk about some of the theory behind participatory research and how do we get communities engaged in research, but then also talk about some of my own research where I've had the honor of really getting to be in communities and get to know them is just a really cool opportunity. So thank you so much. Please put any questions you have along the way in the chat. I will look at them as soon as I'm done presenting. I'm going to try to talk fast because I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear your thoughts and really touch base on all the things you're wanting to learn. I was able to look at some of what you wanted to learn in the presentation prior to doing it. So I added some slides for a lot of you. I was like, oh my goodness, if they're interested in that, we'll have to add that too. So I hope I covered everything and this is just really fun. So I want to get started just talking a little bit about why participation matters, right? We have to start there. So one thing I want all of you to think about as you're doing your research or working in communities is really understanding that research has helped us understand that community participation really does improve relevance. Going down to a lower point, it really does help us take our research and increases that real world impact, which is what we're all doing. We all want to do research where we're actually helping people at the end of the day. And so it really does help us do that. It also strengthens integrity of our research, right? Because of the reason we can really apply it to real world. We really can learn things that we can use. And it changes what we study, but it also changes how our findings are used because it really does shift the interpretation of our findings. So it absolutely changes what we're looking at and it changes the way we interpret it. It just creates this lens for us to really understand the lived experience of individuals that we're hoping at the end of the day to support. So I want to talk a little bit just about some of these community-based participatory research goals that I know you probably know a lot about, but I want to talk briefly about theory. And I will say this list has been derived from a lot of different research articles. And I've added a few things because I'm like, this is important too. But we're going to go through this briefly, and then we're going to really talk about, I picked 4 research projects that I've had the honor of being a part of. And we're going to talk about how these CBPR principles really did apply to that. So make it come to life where you're like, it's not just a theory. People actually do this, and this is how. So I'm hoping it's really helpful. So I want to start off just about talking about the first point because I think it's the most important. I don't know, I put a really important one lower. I'll talk about it in a second. But we want to begin with relationships. So that's really where, when you're thinking about best practices in engaging communities in research, you've got to build relationships and connection. And I'm going to go ahead and jump down to a point I have later. This takes time. You are going to hear the term time a lot in this presentation because I cannot stress it enough. But how we really build strong relationships is we build trust through this sustained presence. So we want to be involved. We want to have continued communication where we're meeting with people. And we really want to invest in these relationships before we finalized our research project. And I will admit, just like everyone else, I've absolutely wrote a grant and asked like a community, hey, if I get this grant, can I come hang out with you? That's just not the best way to do it. Really, the best way to do it is to develop the research project with the community. All the projects I'm going to talk about today, that was done. And you can tell an absolute difference when you're looking at results. So it's magical if you can get in that community before, start building the relationship, understanding their lived experience, understanding their needs, and adapting what you were thinking to really fit those needs. So that is what we want to think about doing. And that's really how the relationships start. Getting in there early segues perfectly into this concept of co-creating goals and research questions. So setting down and doing this collaboratively, again, talking about what are your community needs, what is missing, and how can this data support you in a way that really does create improvements for families and communities. To get at the table and really co-create goals and research questions, we have to understand that they are experts. So we are sitting down at the table with some of the most important experts we've ever talked to, because again, they have all the knowledge of that community. They understand the needs. We haven't walked in their shoes. So they are giving us the opportunity to really become an expert in what we're trying to do research in. So I think coming to the table, acknowledging that expertise, and showing and honoring and respecting everything they say is so important. And that really is us making sure we are engaging the community as contributors throughout the research project, not just at the beginning, not just in the middle. And I'm going to talk more about this, but really being engaged the entire time. We also want to be culturally responsive. And, I'm going to talk a lot about culture in different ways, but culture can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but understanding every family has a different culture, every community has a different culture. So how are we thinking about how we adapt methods, materials, our protocols, really to reflect those cultural values of the people that we are going in and getting to spend time with? And, part of this, of course, is language. That's kind of the easy one where we're like, I've done a lot of work with Latino families. I'm going to talk about this project. We know we have to change language oftentimes with those projects, but it's so much more. It's thinking about how do we approach individuals? How are we respectful? How do we do everything in a way that really is much more than language, but this broader culture? And understanding that you could have different cultures within a culture is very important. We're going to talk about that at some point too. We also want to think about shared decision making. And this goes back to some of those earlier points of just seeing others as the expert. So we want to involve them in that decision making process. And part of that is creating a space where we can share that power. And I think this segues nicely into thinking about ethics and reflexivity, because we have to know that ethics goes beyond IRB approval. It's also thinking about what is ethical in this community? What is ethical for this culture? And we have had to change IRBs because we realized we messed up. We're like, we said we would collect data this way, but we realized that didn't work. It's not working. We need to make some shifts. We need to make an addendum. We really need to be careful and make sure that we're doing everything, not just for IRB, but also for that community and culture. And knowing that part of this is understanding this ongoing reflection. All the research talks about reflexivity as really leading back to 3 things: understanding your own position, your power, and just the responsibility you have. So when we're walking in, oftentimes, many of us have degrees that can make people feel like we know things that maybe we don't even know, right? And so how do we come to the table? We realize there can be a power differential. We respect that. We also even the playing field by making them realize, no, they're the expert, right? We may know a lot about a small area, but they know a lot about everything else. And how do we make sure that we're just reflecting and understanding that power differential and respecting it? We also, part of that reflexivity and ethics is ensuring the community benefits, right? And that we're building capacity in the community. I always say we want to leave a community better than we found it, because I have never left a community and not been better, right? They always add value to our lives and our research. So we want to make sure that's reciprocal in nature. So how are we making sure that we're leaving them with something really positive? So we want to design the research that benefits them, but we also want to think about other ways we could support the community in terms of learning, empowering them, so that when we leave, they can continue to do work that betters people. And oftentimes we come back and work with them again because they're doing really cool stuff. They're like, hey, will you join us again? We got a grant. And so this really creates that lifelong collaboration as well. And then here is time. I feel like it should be like every third point, time. Because you may notice all of this stuff takes time. So you really want to allow lots of time, more than you think, for relationship building, feedback, adaptation or flexibility, and realizing this is a long-term engagement commitment. Like, you're not just going to meet someone one time and put them in a grant. It really is, it's friendship, it's relationships, it's building and understanding their life, which is what an honor to be able to do that. And then last I'm going to talk about throughout is communication and transparency. So communication is that time again. We've got to have open communication. We have to have regular meetings when we're collaborating in communities, but we also want transparency. We want to be able to share findings in an accessible way for them that's getting feedback, but transparency also creates comfort and safety. So we want them to trust that we're being honest, that we're being transparent, that they understand what's happening. And that, again, goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It's that trust. So we have to maintain that throughout. So now I'm going to talk about the research projects. And I should say the terms I'm using to describe the amazing groups that I worked with are the terms that they chose to be called at the time of the research. So I always use the terms that they refer to themselves as. Now, when I publish research, sometimes that looks a little bit different. I get permission first, though, before I change any term. When we talk about what terms are used in research, if they don't feel comfortable, I explain it in the paper. Again, everything's done in conjunction with those that I have the honor to spend time with. But I'm going to talk about two projects with Latino families. For both projects, I partnered with Latino Community Development Agency, one in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa. Dr. Amanda Morris worked on one of those projects with me. It was amazing. All of these are amazing. We're going to talk about adaptation and implementation of Safe Care, which is a child abuse prevention model, and then adaptation and implementation of Legacy for Children. And that's a parenting model in its group. So that all these parents get to hang out in a group and they have a group leader, and it's absolutely amazing. I'm also going to talk about a project in the American Indian community, and we partnered with the Choctaw Nation for that project. That also I did in conjunction with Dr. Amanda Morris, and also we have Melissa on the webinar too. So if they need to jump in, they can answer questions or jump in at any point. This was an amazing project we just wrapped up. So this one's really fresh in our minds, and it was really fun and exciting. We're going to talk a lot about that one. And then, when we talk about culture, I feel like I have to throw in this other project because I think it's really important to think that culture can mean a lot of different things. So the last one is working with families experiencing high risk factors. And really this encapsulates, for this project, the culture of poverty. It is very different, and there's a lot of different ways we have to respect that community and honor the way their lived experience looks like. So with that one, I put partner as the community because we partnered with so many people in some really cool ways, which I'll talk about. So that was engaging families in safe care, again, is that child abuse prevention model. Now, I have to say, before I talk about these cool projects, I have to talk about cultural humility, because you're coming into these amazing places and we have to understand sort of the space that we need to be in to really engage well. So I want to talk briefly just about cultural humility and research. It really does lend itself to this lifelong learning and self-reflection of how are we coming to the table? What are our own experiences? What is our own culture? How does that impact how we speak, how we process information? A lot of that reflection. Also, it's that recognition of power imbalances, which can look different depending on the group, right? I think about when working in a culture of poverty, you don't even realize the clothes you wear when you walk in a house can create a power imbalance, right? So what are we wearing? How are we speaking? How are we approaching people? So this can mean a lot of different things, but it's always learning. I would love to say I've never made mistakes, but I do all the time. But I'm really good at asking how I can do better, and I keep getting better at it. So that's the beauty of learning and having cultural humility. Another is just accountability to communities, realizing that sometimes they are a more vulnerable population. And how do we make sure we're honoring that and being respectful of that and giving them the things they need, not taking advantage of them in any way? And then this willingness to be changed by the work. And I will say, this is the fun part. For those of you that know me, every project is my favorite. I'm always like, this is the best project ever. And this is the reason why I have never not been changed by a project, because you really are going into people's space, right? Like you're getting to walk alongside of them. When participation goes well, you're getting insight into their life and understanding the fabric of what made them make decisions and what would be more helpful. And it's just beautiful. So I think going in with cultural humility is saying, I don't know anything, but I'm so excited to learn. And this is going to change me. And it absolutely will. Now, I have to say there's a difference in cultural humility and cultural competence. So competence, we hear this all the time, is it really does imply mastery, which, as you can probably hear me say, you really can never have cultural competence as a researcher because the culture is always changing, right? I even think about the projects I've done with groups pre and post COVID. Completely different culture, completely different dynamic. So I have to go in, even if I'm revisiting an amazing community that I've been to before, I have to find out what's changed. How are things different? How have the needs changed? Because these things shift. So just learning is ongoing, which is exciting for me. I know a lot of you are still in training. I'm sorry to say this, it doesn't ever go away. You're going to always be a lifelong learner, but this is the fun part. So I also want to talk about what this looks like in practice a little bit. It really does entering a community saying, I am not the expert, you are, and I'm so excited to be here and to learn, to be really open to critique and correction. This can be hard sometimes because we have ideas about what we want to do, but we have to be flexible. And sometimes that goes back to time, building in time. When you're writing the grant, build in as much time as you can, because when they're giving you critique and correction, you have to have the time to be flexible and make those changes and still have a successful project. And then just always recognizing how institutional power can shape these research relationships, even to the basic level. I remember one time I was doing a project and we scheduled the meeting at a university setting. And I realized everyone was late. And I was like, hey, I want to talk about what was it like getting here today? And I'm a qualitative researcher, so I love asking these questions. They're like, it was really hard. I didn't know where to park. It was hard to get in here. It was in between, all the students came out in between classes. It was overwhelming. I was like, oh my goodness. I did not recognize how difficult it is to get on campus. Like it's something I do every day, but you don't realize these things can be really hard. So how do you think about that? How do you meet partners where they are? And how do you ask for feedback to make sure you're not messing up again and again? I mean, that's where cultural humility really comes in. So now we're going to get to, I think, the good part, hearing about the research projects. So I want to start off, there's 2 research projects within the Latino community. Both of these are absolutely beautiful, but the first one I want to talk about is Safe Care. And what you're going to notice in the slides is you're going to notice words bolded. And when you see a bolded word, that really is, we're linking it back to that CBPR concept. And they may use different words, but they're all similar. But what I want to say is, all of these projects used all of the CBPR concepts, but I didn't have time to tell you every project how it did it. So what I did is I picked out some of the highlights and my favorites. So I won't talk about time on every project, but trust me, time was there. There's one where time was even more impressive, which is this first project. So you'll notice I'll kind of go through so you can kind of see how these theories sort of come to life within these projects. But the first project, again, was that adaptation implementation of Safe Care. And just to give you a little more background on Safe Care, because I'm going to talk about it again in a second in that last project. Safe Care, again, is a child abuse prevention model. It's amazing because it's a home-based program. So we really are meeting people where they are. What's even more unbelievable is these are the families experiencing the highest risk factors. And when I say that, these are families that have interpersonal violence, they have mental illness, they have substance abuse in their family. So to qualify for the program, you have to have one of those high risk factors. And I will say there's even a version of Safe Care done with people in the child welfare system. So they have even more high risk factors and even have had to have people come in and give them higher level support. What's amazing to me is this program is done by bachelor level providers, and they just do serious training. So these amazing people at a bachelor level come in and support these families. So I have always been passionate about this program. I got to work with this program for several decades, so it's absolutely amazing. And what happened is I had the opportunity, because we wanted to adapt it for Latino families. And I was like, oh my goodness, in a heartbeat, absolutely yes. What I loved about this project is this was a state funded project, this part of it. So it really did give us the time to kind of go a little bit slower. So first, what we did is you can see we co-created goals and research questions, which is such an honor to be able to do that in any project. So we went in at the very beginning and we met with the Latino Community Development Agency, this time in Oklahoma City, and we said, what do you guys need? Like, you have all these great programs, you have all these strengths at your agency, you're doing all this amazing work. What do you wish you had? So we kind of talked through what they had. And then we said, we have this program. Let us tell you about it. Would it fit these needs? Would it not? Do you need a different program? Because we have these over here too. And they really thought that Safe Care would be an amazing program. But we were honest. We said, it's never been adapted for a Latino population. And we'd love to do that with you. And they said, we would love that. We also talked a lot about, while we're doing this research, what data can we collect to really support your goals at your agency, in your community? What do you wish you knew? What do you wish you knew more about? And so even thinking about the research side of things, we made sure that we weren't just adapting a program, but when we were implementing it, we were giving them the things that they needed. Because, we have research questions, but what are theirs? What do they need to know? And what would help them? And then time. This was the luxury of time. So this would be like the gold standard of a project of time. We met with them for years, weekly. I am still really close to everyone on this project. We spent so much time together, and it was probably the most fun I've ever had in adapting a model. So we reviewed everything through a cultural lens. So again, these weekly meetings sometimes lasted 1 to 2 hours. We looked through all the material. We reviewed everything. What was so fun about this is language, of course, is going to get adapted, right? So that's an obvious, but this is so much more than language. It was thinking through, how do we recruit? How do we approach families? And one of the things you have to remember about all this is I learned so much, and this has been years ago. So this is very different. The climate has changed, but even then we were having families that were being deported. And so how do we approach families sensitively? How do we make sure that they know they're safe? And so all of these things, we learned so much about just racism, about the struggles families go through to just live. And so it was amazing, beautiful. We have several published articles from this work, and it was life-changing, being able to just learn more about the lived experience of these amazing families. So we talked about culture, we talked about values, about, of course, language and what things meant. And what's beautiful about this project too, and I said there's culture within cultures, we learned a lot about where people came from that live in Oklahoma City that were Latino, Hispanic, and how all of these had a little bit different culture. And what that gave us the power of really training our providers well, and saying part of what we have to do is everyone has to have this cultural humility. We have to go in and say, tell me where you're from. Tell me what it was like to parent there. Tell me what it's been like to move here. What are some of the struggles you've had? So we also were able to not only think through adaptation through that lens, but also implementation of the program through that lens. And it fed back to a lot of training and understanding and practicing, which was really a lot of fun. Since I'm a child psychologist, I can't imagine anything more fun than helping people walk into a room and make people feel comfortable. It was really beautiful. So we learned about different foods. They were so much fun. I have tons of recipes now. We learned about different foods. We learned about parenting practices. We learned about medical care. So part of what Safe Care does is it helps parents make decisions on when to take children to a clinic versus a hospital or an ER. And what was beautiful about that is we learned a lot about all of these more culture specific illnesses and how do we be respectful of their culture, but also help them understand when it's reached a level where maybe some of their own remedies aren't working, and how do we make that next step and make that decision, but also respect what they do within their culture as well. We also help baby proof the house. So how do we do that respectfully? Because every house has a different setup and people want things in a different place. So how do we approach that really well? We learned new songs to sing to kids and implemented those in lots of different dialects. It was just a lot of fun, but it took time, as you could tell. But it was time well spent. And I should say on this project, the next one was sort of a follow-up because we also collaborated with the same group. And so all of that work we'd done, we knew things to adapt the next program, right? We still had more work to do, don't get me wrong, because the curriculum was different, but that learning could be definitely added to lots of other projects. So it's beautiful. So that leads me to talking about the next project, Legacy for Children. So again, we were in this mode of we wanted, it had actually been adapted at some level, but we knew the culture of Latino families in Oklahoma was a little bit different than other places in the US. And so we wanted to make sure that it was appropriate. So the first thing we did was this multi-level participation. So because we had this great relationship with the LCDA in Oklahoma City, we were able to partner with them again, and they were like, they loved the program. They're like, it fits a different need because families come together in a group setting, and that gives them connection to make with other parents. So this is beautiful. They can use our space. So we knew it was a good fit because they told us. So then what we did is we invited supervisors and providers of Safe Care, the program we adapted, to look at all the material. So we did this huge focus group several different times. They went through all the material. They gave us feedback. They said what they liked, what we could add. And it was just gorgeous. So we had this multi-level participation that we were using people from other projects and things to give feedback on this. And then, of course, we also talked to parents, and that's where that multi-level, we said, what do you think of this? What could be better? So we had all of these wonderful focus groups and individual interviews to really learn about the program prior to adapting, prior to implementation. And you can tell by everything I talked about, we had a lot of feedback loops. And I think that's another important part of community-based participatory research of how do we have lots of different feedback loops, because we need all of this great information. So to add to this, I told you on the previous slide what we did with the focus groups, but we also did individual interviews at several different points during implementation so that if something was not going well, if they didn't like something, we could make changes. And that data was gorgeous. I was saying to Julie earlier, this is such a fun presentation, but I don't have time to talk about all the cool outcomes. I will say they loved everything. It was, I have a meeting, I think later today to talk about one of the publications on this. And it was talking about just, did they find it culturally acceptable? And they did, they loved it. You know, one of the things that one of the quotes I remember was, they said that it was different than their culture, but that parenting is a universal language. And I love that. They followed it up by saying it wasn't exactly like our culture, but we could accept it. Anyway, it was beautiful. So we have so many beautiful quotes like that. But I think it starts with meeting families and communities where they are, because imagine how different that this project, any of these projects might have been if we just came in and said, we're going to do this. You need this. Instead, we said, what do you need? Let's see how this fits. Let's adapt it to make it even better. So it really is coming from a place of cultural humility. Now we're going to talk about another project. And I know, again, Alyssa and Amanda are on here so they can speak up, but this was a program we did in American Indian communities. And I say that because we partnered with the Choctaw Nation, but we collected data from lots of different tribes. So we actually went back to where I grew up to do this. So I am Choctaw, and this area has a lot of these amazing tribal communities. And so we were able to go there, collect data from a lot of different tribes, but we really partnered with Choctaw Nation. And I think one of the things we have to think about when we think about tribal work, I had to talk about this specific to this, is tribal sovereignty. How do we really respect and understand that at the end of the day, the tribe has the ultimate final authority on all of this. And we have to respect that from the very beginning. And I talked earlier about IRB and making sure that it's also correct with the community. It's with the tribe, this is easy because we actually submitted everything to their tribal IRB as well. So there was a lot of back and forth. Melissa did so much work to make sure everything we did, there was a lot of feedback. So it's not like they're like, yes, we love everything. It's what about this? And what about that? And have we thought about this? I mean, they approved all of our flyers. They changed language. And by the way, their input was amazing. I can honestly say they made everything so much better. So they were just a beautiful partner, but you can tell we didn't just partner with a group at the Chickasaw Nation. We were also really partnering with the IRB, with all of these different individuals in high power to make sure our research was appropriate. So we had so much collaboration within the nation. And really, the reason for tribal sovereignty is to really ensure the protection of the tribe. There is just a lot of generational trauma related to research and people coming in and collecting data with all of the cultures that I'm talking about. But with this culture, it's been very well documented. And so we just want to make them feel safe. And we want to make sure that we are giving back to the tribe and we're respecting all of the data that we're learning. So this really impacts every level. It impacts how we collected data, how we share data, how we store it, how we report it. So just to give you an example, when we want to talk about this project in any way, if we want to do a research poster, if we want to do a manuscript, everything has to be approved by the tribe, and it takes several months. So we have to, anytime we see a call for a paper or a call for a presentation, we have to work backwards and know that we have to prepare it several months in advance, get them a copy. I will say that we do this with all of our partners too. I think the process takes longer with American Indian population typically because they have a tribal IRB, but what I'm describing should be done with all of the cultures you're working with. You should always get feedback on, does this make sense? Did I capture this right? Did I miss anything? So this should be done with all of our projects, but it's very clear with this one. Also, shared decision making was so easy to see with this project, even though, again, it happens in all of them, because we really did have joint decision making at every stage. So they helped pick out measures. They even added a measure that was Chickasaw specific, and then they helped us adapt it a little bit so that other tribes could fill it out, that talked about culture and how you think about culture in your own life. So, I mean, really everything from the measures to the methods to interpretation of findings. I can't tell you how many times we've had meetings and they're like, oh, think about this. We're even having a meeting on this project in a few weeks where I'm presenting the qualitative data to make sure they like the sort of the framework I'm framing all of the data in so they can give feedback, like think about this or pull in this research. So they really are even helping us again have that cultural lens with all of the research that we're doing with them. And then I talked about dissemination. They're helping with that piece as well. You know, I also should say they're also on manuscripts and they also take lead in presenting this data. One of the partners presented this at a national conference the other day. I helped her put together the presentation. I wasn't able to go. But I mean, this truly is a true collaboration where we view this as their data as much as our data. We're true partners and we help each other. So I want to share one other thing on this project because it's so important, and that's this idea of relational accountability. And this is another one of those ongoing contact, but it's really special what we were able to do with this grant. So we, of course, had these weekly meetings during the grant. We held those via Zoom because we actually are a bit of a distance from the tribal site where we collected data at. The point in a second will show how we offset that. But then we also had these biannual in-person meetings where we actually went to the tribe, met with them in their space, and basically spent the whole day, whole afternoon eating food, talking, brainstorming, or also presenting our findings. We've done that several times as well. We also had this luxury of having research assistants that lived in the area for the summer and worked with the tribe daily so that we had feet on the ground. For the first summer, I met with them weekly. For the second summer, Melissa met with them weekly. And really, we got to hear about their experience, what was going on, help us understand, do we need to shift data collection? What do we need to do? What's going well, what's not? And then they just immerse themselves in the culture. So imagine they're going to be a huge partner as we finish writing up data, because they understand being there more than any of us. So we had this beautiful balance of maybe we had meetings at Zoom, but we had partners there the whole time. It was really a cool way to think about that time piece. So you don't have to have your entire team there all the time, but can you have research assistants that really are and that are immersed in that culture and that group? So the last project I want to talk about really, again, speaks to this culture of poverty for this group, and really was families that are experiencing really high risk factors. And I think I said this before, but I want to say it again. High risk factors for these families really involve substance use, interpersonal violence, or mental illness. So these were families that were really struggling. And what's interesting is families with these high risk factors, they need the most support oftentimes. But they are oftentimes the hardest to engage, which is why this was such an important project for us to do. We really wanted to understand how to engage better. So the first thing we did is we realized we have to have constant contact with this community while we're doing this work. But we also realized that if families have all these factors, it might be difficult sometimes for them to give feedback in a consistent way. There are just a ton of barriers, which is why Safe Care goes into the home. But what we did think is we could create a parenting partnership board, right? So if we created a monthly meeting where we brought families together, we helped them with transportation, we provided them with food, we even sent them with food for the rest of the weekend. We'd have them on Fridays. So we sent food, like take-home bags too, so they have food to take home, and childcare. And what's crazy, it started out as childcare, but then we actually started teaching the kids curriculum on like how to keep your body safe, how to have kind hands, depending on their age. So it ended up being a learning experience for the kids. So I'm saying this because remember earlier when I was talking about the CDP principles, I said, you need to leave people better. They were leaving us so much better. We had to brainstorm, how can we do this for them? How can we make sure we're giving back to them in the best way possible? But as you can tell, the first principle that really pops up is power sharing, right? We made it clear to them that they really did influence our decisions. We were bringing them in monthly. We also gave them a stipend because, and I haven't brought that up, but we really have to think about when you're writing your grants, paying participants, because typically when you have someone with expertise, they get paid for that expertise. And so that can hold a lot of value, is thinking about how do we compensate people for their time and their expertise. But they really sat down and helped us understand what questions are worth asking when it comes to engagement. So back to the very beginning, how are they recruited? Because the first part of engagement is recruitment. If we can't get people to let us in their door, we can't help them through this program. How do we interpret data? How do we share the findings in a way that's really powerful? So you can see how they sat at the table and really told us everything. And I'm going to talk about the next step after power sharing in a slide in just a second. But there was ongoing participation. So we really had this community involvement throughout the project with these monthly meetings. And this is what's so important after power sharing is we actually made changes from the feedback. We followed up that next month and we said, you told us this, we did this. Now, I will say there's sometimes they would say, do this, and we couldn't for a reason. Sometimes we have limitations on what we're capable of doing. We would explain that and say, let's brainstorm. How could we get adjacent to this great idea? Like, what else could we do that could help families? So part of that is accountability, right? We let them know that we were honoring their community, we were honoring their thoughts. So we held ourselves accountable to not just hearing that information, but then actually making it happen. And that was clear communication. And again, there were goals, there were limitations. We made changes in plans. We shared findings of what they told us that worked. Sometimes we said, let's try again. It's because we're not getting the outcome we wanted. We know you guys have the answers. And we were maintaining this relationship way past the grant. So we started the Parenting Partnership Board probably 20 something years ago. It still exists. Sometimes they ask me to be a guest speaker. I've moved out of the community, but I get to come back and hang out with them sometimes, which is wonderful. I should also say, and you can tell how long that went, really talking about time. We also had every different, season is the best way. Like we would have like a winter party and we'd have like a summer party. I brought my children, they brought their kids, everyone played together. So it really was like a family. And I say that because part of what you're asking people is to be vulnerable, right? You're asking people to tell me your needs, tell me your hardest things you're dealing with. And so sometimes you have to be vulnerable too and let them meet your family. And and understand where they're coming from. So I just want you to know, you always want good boundaries, but you also want to realize that you want to meet people where they are. And that may mean sometimes you being vulnerable as well. So I think this is another really great example of reflexivity. We were continually examine how we shape the research as researchers. I think this is really clear with all cultures, but especially when it comes to the culture of poverty. I talked about going into homes and thinking about what we were wearing and how we were approaching. Even, I remember I had the honor in all this work that I got to go in the homes with individuals and do some interviews. So understanding how you react when you go into a home. If, for example, if there are bugs in the home, how are you reacting? Are you making them feel bad, right? Because they're not choosing to have a space with bugs. And how do you help, be respectful? There's just so many places of reflexivity and thinking about how and mitigating maybe your own reactions, your own thoughts, and being really respectful of other people. And so all of this you can tell is learning from participants. So really treating community members as teachers, evaluators of the research process, and really being transparent so you can reduce fear. And remember, a lot of these families were involved with child welfare sometimes, or they were on the edge of being involved. So it's sometimes being transparent made them feel comfortable because there was fear of, are you going to take my children if you come in here? And helping them understand, no, we're coming in here to help and support you. So we also, with this project, we did follow-up interviews, which was beautiful. So we talked to all these families as well, and that really lends itself to that ethical follow-through. So after data collection ends, we followed up, we said, what could we do better? We shared those findings, and we acknowledged the contributions of others, right? So if you'll ever notice any of these publications, the Parenting Partnership Board is oftentimes on there, or the families that were able to engage in this program are honored. So how do we think about that? We also just think about how ethical follow-through is also how findings inform practice, policy, or community decision-making. How do we share this with the broader group? With this project, we actually went to the legislator and shared this work and how it was helping families and how we were gaining lived experience prior to deciding what kind of research we were doing. This is so cool too. We also trained, if they were interested, the Parenting Partnership Board, we found a program where we empowered them and they learned how to be advocates of policy so that they could go to the legislator and talk about the needs of their community. We had 2 people that went through the training. They practiced sometimes in our meetings, practiced presenting. They went to the legislator. They're still doing the work. Because I can say things, but it means so much more when it's coming from someone with that experience. So I think that's a beautiful example of that ethical follow through and leaving a community better than how you found it. So I'm going to really quickly talk about lessons learned to try to kind of wrap this up. There's so much information. One, I know this isn't going to surprise you. Participation takes time, right? And meaningful participation is relational. So it's building relationships, it's building friendships, it's that connection. Also just thinking through culture shapes meaning. Every part of the research, right? And in these projects, culture shaped how people interpret parenting, safety, resilience, and help-seeking behaviors, all of these things. I also think you'll notice too that interventions, because a lot of this was implementation science that I'm talking about, it carries implicit cultural assumptions. And the only way we avoid those negative cultural assumptions is to talk to people and ask questions. I also wanted to say a lesson learned is trust requires consistency. You've got to show up. You've got to show up every time. You've got to keep having those meetings because trust is built through repeated, reliable actions. And you have to remember a lot of these cultures haven't always had positive interactions with researchers. So sometimes you're undoing work that you had nothing to do with negative interactions. So just remember that. But if you are consistent, trust will be built. Also realize that power sharing improves quality. So I think as researchers, sometimes we get sort of set in our ways. If you do things this way, it's the best outcome. And I am telling you, share the power because it really does strengthen all of the science because it really is learning from experts and what you're trying to research. So a few practical guidelines I want to share really quickly is you're probably like, she keeps talking about time, but how do I do this? So when you think about time, do this. You want to budget for relationships, resources, and then flexibility. And I talked earlier about how write this into your grant. So with relationships, start early while you're writing the grant. And I know that's hard to do, but there are ways you can do that a little bit more briefly and knowing you'll get more time later, and then meet often, especially once the grant is funded. resources, really what I'm talking is think about budgeting time for that, because these partnership boards, these interviews, these focus groups, they take time. They take resources. So factor that in from the beginning. And then flexibility, because you have to make changes. So factor that time in. So when I'm talking about time, think of those three things, and that's going to help you make sure that you're honoring that commitment to time. With decision making, I just want you to think about this. And I think about this all the time in my research. Participation is not just input, it's influence. And there's a huge difference. And how do you honor that? How do you respect it? So if you walk away with that practical guideline for decision making, you're going to be in great shape. And then culture, right? Just honor the value of the people you're working with. And honoring values really is hearing them talk, asking questions, and making sure what you're doing is culturally responsive. And the last thing is just share. So you want to share results with families, stakeholders, and you want that transparency so they know that what they're doing matters, which is beautiful. And I think I made it with time for questions. So you'll notice this thank you slide. It does have my information, and I want to hear you guys talk, but there's also tons of different things on the slide. These are funders, they're agencies, they're partners. I hope I didn't leave anything out because there was a lot with these projects, but it takes a lot of people to make something like this happen. And I just want to honor and respect that. There were so many people, and what a beautiful thing that I got to be a part of something so magical. I'm going to try to stop share now. And now you guys can ask questions. I'm trying to get into the chat, I promise, but it's not easy for me. I think I got out of sharing. Okay, now I can see more of your faces. You guys ask any questions, but I'm also seeing if any are in the chat.
I had a question. Hi, Crystal. Um, Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And this could be just due to me being new to graduate school, but I was just wondering more around language used in funding and funding applications. I really appreciated the point you made of paying participants. I think that's definitely important. I guess my questions are around like putting together a community advisory board and then making sure they're paid as well, even though they're not participants, but they're, experts in this other way. So I guess I was just wondering around, yeah, language used in those grant applications and kind of what that looks like.
Well, some are easier than others, right? So some grants do have restrictions. So usually it's pretty easy to write in compensation for the parent advisory boards. What's honestly the hardest is the food. So sometimes it's hard to use grant money for food. That's the hard part. But I will say I got really good at cooking crock pot meals in my office the day on Fridays. And I could get it down to like for $50, I could feed like a lot of people. Like it was crazy. And I will say too, we get donations. So the food that I would get, so there's not a perfect answer, Crystal, but I don't want you to give up because we have been very innovative in lots of different ways. Now, there are some grants that love participation. In fact, it's required. Like if you really want to do this kind of work, PCORI is a great funding agency to go look at. So they expect you to have these parent advisory committees, these interviews, this participation in the community. That's a little bit easier to write it into. But I think a lot of the when you say write it in, I think writing it from that perspective of we want to compensate experts for their time. And when you start using that kind of language, I think it holds a lot of weight. Does that make sense? But it is more than just the gift cards for their time, because oftentimes we use gift cards, but it's also making sure transportation's met. How we did that sometimes is we increase the compensation on the gift card to include not just time, but also gas. So that's how we got around that sometimes. And then food, we got really good at getting donations for food. We got really good at getting donations for like during the holidays. We wanted all the kids to take home like a backpack with stuff to do over the holiday while they weren't in school. And I'm really talking now about that last grant. But Amanda, we faced this with LCDA and food. right? We partnered with them. They had a kitchen so they could help us make food for families. So, Crystal, what I would say is think outside the box because, I don't know if I stress this enough, but we talk about the needs of the community of what we want the research to be. But while we're doing the research, we have to think about the needs of the community. So when we're going in and asking for feedback and doing all these things, we have to think about how are we making sure we're taking care of them, right? And so you're bringing up so many good points. I hope that was helpful.
Super helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a question about adapting like currently existing interventions. How do you decide which interventions should be adapted? Because there might be a point where when you're adapting them, they might just become a whole new intervention entirely.
Okay, this is the best question ever, and I will tell you. It's interesting, and this is part of the dilemma in adaptation, right? Because I think one thing I've learned is we don't need to completely adapt every program. I think things have a core model, and I love that one of the Latino families said this, that parenting is a universal culture. There were things that needed to be changed a little bit, but the core of the intervention was good. And I would say that's usually the case for programs. I can't think of any that I've ever seen where I'm like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. That's evidence-based, right? And I don't think you have to go to the extent we did, to be honest, Pia. I don't. I think what we really did is we wanted to think about a framework. And I think we published some of that. So I think the work we did, for example, with the LCDA on that first project really taught us about process and about questions and how do we look at things. But I think everything needs to be adapted a little bit. I think if you've got a well-trained provider, they understand where flexibility is in the model and they make that happen. And I think the key is cultural humility. I can't go back to that enough. It's walking in and realizing. And also, I just want you to know, like, even after adaptation, I know for a fact we walked into homes and you can tell by people's body language, like, oh, I don't know about that. And that can happen with any program, with any culture, right? It just isn't what their family does. And so cultural humility is being like, hey, I noticed your reaction. I want to talk about this because I don't want anything I do here to make you uncomfortable. Can we please process this? Because, I want this to work for you. Let's talk about it and then figure out flexibility. Because oftentimes these programs, especially parenting programs, are giving people ideas, right? They're giving them theories, they're giving them concepts, and then we create example behaviors to do it. But one behavior may not work for every family. So do you see the flexibility? The theory's there, right? The stuff we know is going to help them, like child safety, like, understanding how to make the house safe and understanding how to take them to the doctor when they need it. So you don't have a child that gets really sick. The behavior, on the other hand, may need to look very different depending on the family. And that's where the flexibility goes in. And so a lot of this work, the magic happens in training your provider, is what I will say. I hope that was helpful because, again, this could be talked about all day too. There could be a whole webinar on what you just asked because it's complicated, right? We want to be respectful of cultures, but we also don't want to get into this trap where we have to write a grant to adapt every single program because it's not necessarily needed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lana, I have to leave in just a minute, but I just wanted to point out that we have people from all over the world attending and a number of people from Africa. And I just wonder, not everyone has grants and access to resources. And if you had any tips for people who are working in the field where it's harder to come by just some of the basics.
Absolutely. So I think what I have seen done well in other countries where funding isn't as attainable is how do you do a lot of these concepts in a scaled back way? So I say a lot of what I do is kind of the gold standard, right? Being able to do 50 individual interviews with the tribe and analyze them and do all these, that's gold standard. What I could have done is I could have spent time, and I know time is money, but I could have just went and spoke to people, right? And taken really good field notes. So there's always a different way to do things. There's always a way to get good community information. And so what I would say, if I was a researcher in another country without a lot of funding, I would go in and start there. I would just spend time in the community when I had time. I would take really good field notes. I'd ask really good questions. I'd get to know them. And then honestly, when you the longer you are, the more money finds you. I know that sounds weird, but when you get to know a community, they start to understand what you can offer. Sometimes they have small amounts of money they can help support you with, or you find a grant that fits really well because you're such a good partner with them. So I think start with relationships. And I really feel like then some really magical things can happen. But don't feel like you have to do it exactly the way I was describing. Think about how you can meet communities where you are and you can gather information on your own and you can synthesize it on your own to really think through. Because any amount of information you're getting is magical, right? And again, I get this blessing of like saturation, which means I get to talk to so many people. I see these great themes come out. But that's not to say sometimes one person says one thing and it changes the whole way I think about my research, right? So don't underestimate the power of what you can do.
That was great, Lana. It was such an informative, inspiring presentation. We are out of time, so we're going to end there. But all of you have Lana's email address, and you can certainly send her questions. Patrick will send out a copy of the recording. And I just thank everybody for attending today, and know that our next presentation is next month. And so I hope to see many of you there.